The prevailing narrative fixates on kinetic exchange, hypersonic missiles, drone swarms. This is a strategic misdirection. The launch-on-warning posture required for such assets carries an unacceptable cost and a low probability of deployment outside of a terminal conflict. The focus on visible hardware is a fallacy designed to obscure the real vector of attack. The primary threat is not an explosion, it is silence. Analysts at CSIS confirm the global financial and military apparatus runs on a nervous system of approximately 550 undersea fiber optic cables. These carry over 95% of all international data and $10 trillion in daily financial transactions. This infrastructure is largely unprotected, a systemic liability of the highest order. The second vector of this silent war is orbital. The strategic reliance on satellite constellations for GPS, communication, and intelligence creates a corresponding vulnerability. Ground-based lasers and co-orbital anti-satellite systems are not science fiction. They are deployed assets designed for one purpose: to achieve information dominance by blinding the opponent before the first kinetic asset is even moved. Cutting these data arteries does not require a symmetric response. It renders one impossible. Without data, the Western economic and military machine is a blind leviathan, immense in power, but without sight, direction, or the ability to process information. This is the protocol for paralysis. A solvency crisis triggered not by debt, but by the systemic deletion of data. A state of asymmetric checkmate. The motive is not conquest, it is solvency. A state engaged in a prolonged kinetic conflict it cannot afford faces a mathematical certainty: insolvency. The war becomes a domestic liability, draining liquidity and political capital faster than it can be replenished. This is the core of the solvency crisis. CSIS analysis on Russia confirms this calculus. The prohibitive cost and unpopular nature of the conventional ground war create an unsustainable economic burn rate. When symmetric warfare becomes a vector for state bankruptcy, the entire strategic doctrine must pivot. This is not a choice, it is an imperative. Weakness forces a pivot to asymmetry. The objective shifts from territorial gain to systemic disruption at the lowest possible cost. A state facing a solvency crisis will always choose the weapon with the highest leverage. A single line of malicious code over a tank battalion, a $50,000 drone over a fighter jet. This is why the EU's proposal, reported by the Financial Times, to create a two-tier membership to fast-track a conflict state is not merely bureaucratic maneuvering. It is the deliberate creation of an attack surface. It engineers a systemic liability, a new, fragile zone inside the perimeter, optimized for low-cost, high-impact asymmetric attacks cited by CISA and RUSI as primary threats. The logic is irrefutable. Russia's solvency crisis mandates a pivot to asymmetric warfare. The EU, by institutionalizing a fragile and corruptible frontier, provides the ideal theater for these operations. It creates a strategic vacuum where low-cost attacks can generate disproportionate systemic chaos, forcing the only available response: vertical escalation. The core of this strategy is not ideological, it is mathematical. Reports from security analysts, including the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, put the kinetic cost exchange in stark terms. The price to field a modern main battle tank is approximately $5 million. The price of the FPV drone that can achieve a mission kill against it is as low as $500. This is not a balanced fight. It is a solvency crisis projected onto a battlefield. This radical cost imbalance creates an asymmetric leverage point of 10,000 to 1. An adversary can deploy 10,000 kinetic threats for the cost of a single defensive asset. This economic reality has a clinical designation: the democratization of violence. The barrier to entry for projecting lethal, state-level force has collapsed. It no longer requires a nation-state's treasury. It requires the capital of a small business. By institutionalizing high-cost, high-signature legacy platforms, Western military doctrine creates the perfect systemic liability. It is an open invitation for attrition warfare waged by adversaries with minimal investment. Each drone strike is not just an attack on a vehicle. It is an attack on the financial solvency of the entire defense model. When conventional force becomes economically unsustainable, the system is backed into a corner where the only remaining lever is vertical escalation, a launch-on warning posture for systemic collapse. Controlled demolition of regional stability is not chaos. It is a laboratory. These gray zones are staging grounds designed to test the solvency of Western response protocols. Analysts point to warnings from civil rights leaders in the United States or travel advisories for nations like South Africa and Canada. These are not the primary events. They are proxy battlefields, live fire exercises to measure political breaking points and reaction times before deploying a strategy against the core. The instruments for this experimentation are low-cost and scalable. CSIS confirms that key trends in drone warfare point to a market saturation of cheap, effective kinetic platforms by 2030. Simultaneously, CISA guidance reveals profound vulnerabilities in operational technology, OT, the systems governing our power and water. These are not separate threats. They are a combined arms package for the gray zone. A drone has a lower kinetic cost than an automobile. A cyber attack on an undefended OT node approaches zero. This is a protocol for calibrating escalation. By staging low-yield kinetic events in these proxy laboratories, an adversary gathers invaluable data. What is the precise threshold of damage before a symmetrical military response is even considered? How much internal political friction can be generated before the system fractures? Each incident is a data point, mapping the exact contours of Western institutional fragility. This is not warfare. It is munitions testing against a political target. The blueprint tested in these proxy theaters is designed for one purpose: deployment against the core. The systemic liabilities being deliberately engineered, such as the EU's plan to tear up its accession system for a two-tier model to absorb a conflict state, create the ideal attack surface. The data from the gray zones provides the playbook. The mathematical certainty is that the next phase is the application of these tested, low-cost asymmetric tactics not at the periphery, but against a primary economic target. Expect a deniable, high-impact attack on critical OT infrastructure, staged to look like domestic failure, within 12 months. The core protocol of nuclear deterrence is not retaliation. It is preemption based on data. This is the launch-on-warning doctrine. The system is engineered to launch a full-scale counterstrike upon receiving credible warning of an inbound attack before the first enemy warhead has landed. This is not a choice. It is a mathematical calculation to prevent decapitation and guarantee a response. The entire architecture of strategic command is built on the integrity of its early warning sensor network. This brings us to the fog of digital war. As CISA and its partners issue guidance on the extreme vulnerability of operational technology, OT, to cyber risks, they are mapping out the new primary vector of attack. An asymmetric adversary does not need to launch a missile. They only need to blind the system that detects missiles. A targeted cyber attack on radar and satellite command and control injects systemic uncertainty. The screens go dark. In that moment, the commander faces a solvency crisis of information. Is the blackout a system failure, or is it the deliberate blinding that precedes a full-spectrum first strike? As analysts at CSIS have repeatedly warned, the doctrine of launch on warning does not allow for indecision. The fear of inaction, of being rendered incapable of response, forces the commander's hand. A low-cost cyber probe with zero kinetic signature thus creates a direct vector to the nuclear threshold. The system's digital fragility is the escalation mechanism. The protocol for asymmetric escalation is not theoretical, it is operational. The EU's proposal to institutionalize a two-tier liability by fast-tracking a conflict state is the formal invitation. CSIS and RUSI analysis confirms that adversaries do not mirror symmetric capabilities. They exploit systemic weakness. The CISA guidance on operational technology is not a preventative measure. It is an admission of an undefended attack surface in the kinetic economy. The key trend is not just drone warfare, but the commoditization of standoff munitions. When the kinetic cost of disrupting a trillion-dollar supply chain drops below the price of a luxury vehicle, a test of the system is a mathematical certainty. This is not warfare, it is an arbitrage of fragility. Within the next 12 months, expect a calibration shot. A coordinated cyber and drone swarm event will trigger a 72-hour shutdown of a primary European container port, likely Hamburg or Rotterdam. The objective is not destruction, but paralysis. The attack will be attributed to a non-state actor, making a symmetric, kinetic response impossible. This event will serve as the first data point, quantifying the cost of forcing a system with institutionalized fragility into a launch-on-warning posture.